When the Second World War ended in 1945, most of the world took its first relieved breath in years. Nations began rebuilding, soldiers returned home, and the dead were mourned. But deep in the dense jungles of the Philippine island of Lubang, one soldier never got the message. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and for nearly 3 decades, he continued to fight a war that no longer existed. Onoda was born in 1922 in Japan, raised with the strict discipline and loyalty expected of young men in the pre-war empire. When he joined the Imperial Japanese Army, he was selected for intelligence training, a role that emphasized secrecy, survival, and absolute obedience. His instructors taught him to operate alone, to gather intelligence, and most importantly, never surrender, no matter what. Those words became the foundation of his identity. In late 1944, as Japan faced mounting losses, Onoda received orders that would define the rest of his life. He was deployed to Lubang Island with a small unit and instructed to conduct guerrilla operations against the advancing Allied forces. His direct orders were clear and uncompromising. Do not surrender. Do not take your own life. Continue fighting, even if you are the last man left. These commands were not symbolic. They were the literal operating principles of Japan's wartime doctrine, and for Onoda, they were sacred. In February 1945, American and Filipino forces launched a major operation to capture Lubang. Japanese troops were quickly overwhelmed. Many were killed, others surrendered, and the island fell under Allied control. But Onoda and a small group of surviving soldiers retreated into the island's mountainous jungle. There, hidden under thick vegetation and protected by near-impenetrable terrain, they continued to act as if the war was still raging. At first, their plan was to regroup with other Japanese units and launch counterattacks. But months passed with no reinforcements. The men scavenged food, observed patrol routes, and engaged in small skirmishes. They were convinced the Japanese Empire would eventually return, that the war was turning in their favor somewhere beyond the island. In late 1945, leaflets began falling from the sky. American planes scattered thousands of printed messages declaring that the war had ended and Japan had surrendered. To Onoda, this was an obvious trick. He believed the leaflets were enemy propaganda, designed to lure remaining Japanese soldiers into surrender. He examined the paper, the ink, the layout, everything looked suspicious to him. He dismissed the message. Years passed. The jungle grew around them. The seasons shifted. And Onoda's group shrank. Some died in firefights. Others surrendered when they lost faith in the mission. But Onoda refused to give up. He had been trained to operate behind enemy lines, to assume that every piece of information could be manipulated by opposing forces, and to trust only the direct orders of his commanders. Since no superior officer had ever personally told him the war was over, he believed it was still ongoing. By the early 1950s, Onoda and one remaining companion were the only Japanese soldiers still active on Lubang. Local villagers grew fearful of them, reporting encounters in which the men raided rice stores, stole cattle, or exchanged fire with police. To the villagers, Onoda was a dangerous ghost of a war they wanted to forget. To Onoda, the villagers were enemy collaborators, part of the battlefield he still believed he was defending. The Philippine government and Japanese authorities attempted multiple rescue operations. They dropped personalized letters and photographs from Onoda's family, pleading for him to come home. They used loudspeakers, search teams, and negotiated approaches. But Onoda rejected all of it. In his mind, anything delivered by the enemy could. For most people, the war ended in 1945. For Hiroo Onoda, it ended for everyone else, but not for him. And in the thick Philippine jungle, his life took on a shape that few humans have ever experienced, a decades-long mission fueled by loyalty, fear, discipline, and a belief that surrender was worse than death. During the late 1940s, Onoda and the last remaining members of his small unit established hidden camps deep within Lubang's mountains. They studied patrol routes, mapped ravines, and stored food in bamboo containers to avoid the attention of local villagers. Their existence was a blend of military routine and primal survival. Every sound in the jungle could be an enemy approach. Every rustle of leaves might require an armed response. To Onoda, this wasn't paranoia. It was duty. The men lived under a strict structure. They woke before sunrise, cleaned their rifles, inspected supplies, and rehearsed guerrilla tactics. They treated every encounter as a military engagement. When local farmers heard gunshots or found their fields raided, they reported Japanese holdouts. For villagers, these men were remnants of a devastating war. For Onoda, the villagers were simply enemy collaborators, helping American forces. As the years passed, the psychological strain grew. In 1949, one of the soldiers surrendered, leaving Onoda with only two companions, Private Shimada and Corporal Kozuka. They were loyal, disciplined, and utterly convinced they were still serving the empire. To them, surrender was impossible. In their minds, the Japanese empire was regrouping somewhere beyond the sea, preparing for a counterattack. They believed radio silence was strategic. They believed the leaflets were lies. They believed their survival had meaning. And then, in 1954, tragedy struck. During an exchange of gunfire with local fishermen, Shimada was shot and killed on the beach. Onoda tried to treat him, carrying out the battlefield medical procedures he had learned as a young soldier, but the wound was too severe. Shimada died in the jungle where he had spent almost a decade fighting a war that no longer existed. The loss hit Onoda deeply. Shimada wasn't just a soldier, he was proof that the mission mattered. With him gone, the world of Onoda's wartime loyalty grew even smaller. Now only two men remained, Onoda and Kozuka. For nearly 20 more years, they operated together like shadows, raiding rice fields, avoiding search teams, patching worn clothing with plant fibers, and maintaining weapons that had long outlived their intended service life. Search efforts continued. The Japanese government sent delegations. The Philippine authorities issued amnesty offers. Onoda's own family sent letters and photos. But he refused to believe any of it. One detail explains why. Decades earlier, during training, Onoda was explicitly taught that the enemy would use forged documents, fake broadcasts, and impersonators to break morale. So to Onoda, every message was suspicious by default. By the late 1960s, the world had changed beyond anything imaginable in 1945. Japan was no longer an empire but a global economic power. The Cold War was at full height. Commercial jets crossed oceans daily. Humans had landed on the moon. But deep in the jungle, Onoda woke every morning and cleaned his Arisaka rifle. His bond with Corporal Kozuka became almost brotherly, the type of relationship forged only under extreme isolation. They celebrated New Year's Day every year by raising a handmade Japanese flag. They conducted patrols as if enemy troops still occupied the island. They believed the honor of Japan rested on their shoulders. Then, in 1972, 27 years after the war, tragedy struck again. During an incident where both men attempted to burn a local farmer's rice supply, believing it was aiding enemy forces, police confronted them. Gunfire erupted. In the chaos, Kozuka was shot and killed. His death left Onoda completely alone, the last soldier still fighting a war that ended before many people on the island were even born. News of Kozuka's death traveled across the world. It shocked Japan, bewildered journalists, and reignited. By the early 1970s, Hiroo Onoda had become a living myth. Journalists compared him to a ghost warrior, a man frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. But for Onoda, there was no mythology, no legend, only duty. He had survived 28 years in the jungle by following a set of orders he believed were still active. And nothing, not the letters, not the search teams, not the death of Kozuka, had convinced him otherwise. The Japanese government understood the truth. Onoda would never surrender unless he received direct orders from his commanding officer. There was only one problem. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given Onoda his final orders in 1945, had long since retired. He was no longer in the military. He ran a bookstore. He had not touched a uniform in decades. And yet, the only way to bring Onoda home was to find Taniguchi and send him to the Philippine jungle, almost 30 years after the war ended. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island on a personal mission. Suzuki wasn't a soldier, a diplomat, or a historian. He was a wanderer, someone who lived by instinct and curiosity. When he told his friends he was going to find a panda, a yeti, and Onoda, they laughed. But Suzuki was determined. Unlike the government teams armed with megaphones and documents, Suzuki entered the jungle quietly. He moved the way Onoda did. He listened. He waited. And one afternoon, by a small clearing, Onoda stepped out of the forest holding his rifle, alert, wary, prepared to kill if necessary. What happened next shocked the world. Suzuki didn't run. He didn't raise his hands. He spoke calmly, in Japanese, saying, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." It was the first time in 30 years Onoda had heard words that didn't sound like manipulation. Suzuki spoke with an honesty and warmth that Onoda hadn't heard since his youth. They talked for hours. Suzuki didn't try to force him to surrender. He simply listened. But Onoda still refused to lay down his weapon. He said the same words he had held onto for nearly 3 decades. "I will not surrender until I receive orders from my superior officer." Suzuki nodded and made a promise. "I will bring him to you." Back in Japan, Suzuki located Major Taniguchi, now 72 years old. When Suzuki explained the situation, Taniguchi understood instantly. Despite being retired for decades, despite the war being long over, despite the absurdity of the mission, he agreed. In March 1974, wearing a uniform borrowed from a museum, Major Taniguchi arrived on Lubang Island. Soldiers, journalists, villagers, and government officials waited as he was escorted into the jungle. And then, in a moment that felt more like a scene from a movie than real life, Onoda appeared. Thin, armed, and still dressed in patched clothing from another era. Taniguchi stood before him and read aloud the new orders. "All combat activities are to cease immediately. The unit is to surrender. You are relieved of all duties." Onoda listened in absolute stillness. For the first time in 29 years, he heard the one voice capable of ending his war. He closed his eyes. He inhaled slowly. Then, with deliberate movements, he placed his Arisaka rifle on the ground. To everyone present, it felt like watching an entire century exhale. Onoda surrendered. When he emerged from the jungle, he carried his rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, grenades, a working samurai sword, and a uniform he had kept meticulously patched. Everything was still functional. Everything was ready for battle. He apologized to the villagers for the incidents that had occurred during his guerrilla operations. The Philippine president considered his actions wartime and granted him a full pardon. Japan welcomed him home as a mixture of hero, relic, and cultural symbol. To some, he represented unbreakable loyalty. To others, he embodied tragic devotion to a cause long gone. And to many, he was simply a man who lived in a different reality, one created by war, duty, and isolation. In interviews, Onoda said something that puzzled the world. "I was never alone. I had my orders." He struggled to adjust to modern life. Skyscrapers, cars, television, supermarkets, it was overwhelming. In the jungle, life had been simple: survive, obey, endure. In the modern world, everything felt uncertain. He eventually moved to Brazil, seeking peace in rural life. Later, he returned to Japan to run a survival school for children, teaching resilience, discipline, and clarity of purpose. He lived quietly until his death in 2014. But the legacy of Hiroo Onoda remains one of the most extraordinary stories of the 20th century. A man who never surrendered. A soldier trapped in time. A human being whose reality